would be very hard to overstate the impact that Don Mitchell had on my life, my career, and our family's life. I first met Don in 1965 when I came to interview for a job as assistant vice principal at San Diego High School. He was part of the committee that was looking at those of us candidates. A little background, my wife and I came to California in 1960 to teach school. We were bound and determined to talk to the first California representative who came through our little Missouri school and talk to him about coming to California to teach. Now, when we met this guy, you know, think about this. This is January of 1960. It's cold outside. There's snow on the ground. And he showed us a brochure with palm trees and orange trees. And a possible contract for at least $1,000 a year more than we were making. We didn't care where he was from, as long as he was from Southern California. And we went to Fontana, California to teach. And I'll not get into how in the world we got down here, but that was the best thing that ever happened to us, obviously, a few years later. I became the assistant principal at San Diego when I was 28 years old. I had never dealt with high school kids before, and I was the youngest staff member on the San Diego faculty. Now, Don had joined the board in 1964, and he was appointed or voted to be the president of the school board in 1966. And their task as a school board in those days was to pass a bond to build a new school in the southern part of the district, because they had all this information that the kids were coming from the south, and they had to get a new school down there. And in order to do that, they had to convince the people up in Encinitas to vote for a school down where there weren't any kids at the present time. So they had to put some extra money in the board in that bond to fix up San Diego, which was built in 1937. Well, it failed twice, and through Don's perseverance and excellent organization, they pushed that thing through on the third time toward the end of that 1960 time. It was at the end of the 60s decade. Well, in the meantime, the Vietnam War was heating up, and this was causing all kinds of problems. You may remember that when Ronald Reagan was going to run for governor, one of his planks in his whole program was to fix up that mess down at Berkeley. Well, that mess in Berkeley was creating problems at San Diego and school districts up and down the state of California. The kids were unhappy and the teachers were unhappy. The kids, you know, they wanted to get rid of the dress code. Dress code. The boys wanted to grow their hair longer, and the girls wanted to wear their dresses shorter. Well, they finally got rid of that, of course, and there were all kinds of problems with kids. We were just talking with Scott a minute ago about one of the times when Don and the board had to make some kind of a decision, and there were a number of kids in the audience who were waiting for the decision, and when it came, and they were opposed to it, they bombarded the board with marshmallows. Now, that was called Marshmallow Gate, because the board didn't know what was coming. Obviously, missiles were thrown through the air at them. But Don was very cool. He was pounding the gavel to get order, and said he was going to clear the place and call the cops if he had to. But the kids were running out the doors, obviously. They didn't want to get caught with anybody knowing who they were. But in any case, it was kind of pandemonium frequently. And the teachers were unhappy because they wanted collective bargaining. Well, teachers up and down the state wanted collective bargaining, but it wasn't authorized by the legislature. And they put the pressure on the legislature. And to hold off collective bargaining, the legislature adopted what was called a meet and confer policy. That meant that the board had to meet with the teachers. with the board's representative, had to meet with the teachers, and they had to try to get an agreement. And if they didn't agree, they sent what they disagreed on to a third party who would look at the items and then send them back with some recommendations to the school board. School board still had the power to make the decision, but it went through an arbiter. And when it came back, it was to be, then the board made the decision. Well, when this whole program started, the superintendent was the one who was to meet with the teachers group to represent the school board. Well, that was one guy, and those teachers in those days were mean. They were asking for things that were out of sight, and it was a difficult situation. So the board said, why don't you get some building administrator to meet with you? And of course, who did he choose? He chose me. And I couldn't say no to the superintendent, so I'm going into these meetings with the superintendent. The superintendent got sick after a few more meetings, and I can understand why. So Don came in to the meetings. He said to me, Bill, I will negotiate the money issues and you negotiate the educational issues. Sounds like Don, right? So we then started meeting with this group of 13 members of that teacher group. And I don't know how they chose them, but again, they were asking for the moon. So we met with them for weeks. And finally, there were 128 items that we couldn't agree on that we shipped off to the arbiter. So arbiter sent them back after he looked at them. And then Don, it was at an open board meeting, and Don went over every one of them and talked to his colleagues on the board, and he suggested which ones to take, which ones to modify, and which ones to ignore. And the other board members agreed with him, and they voted 5-0 to take what Don had suggested. Well, the teacher group was in the board meeting at that time. They jumped up and screamed and walked out the door. And again, they were unhappy. Well, and this is it's getting close to 1971, and the board had decided that they probably weren't going to renew the superintendent's contract when it came due in 1972. So they announced that they would have a deal where they would interview candidates for the superintendency. And Don came to me and asked me if I wanted to apply. And he said, hey, I don't even know what a superintendent does, much less want to be one. I said, I want to be the principal in that new high school you're going to build. And he said, Bill, board members don't hire principals, they hire superintendents, and the superintendent hires the principal. He said, now if you want to stick around a while and wait, after we hire the superintendent, then you might he or she might pick you, and then you might be the possible new principal. But that's up to you. There was kind of he was always letting me make the decision for what was going on. I said, look at my background and what kind of education I had. I said, most of the superintendents of districts this size are graduates of big name institutions like USC, et cetera. He said, well, think about it now. The last 3 people who were superintendents while you have been here all had advanced degrees, and they all lost confidence of the board to lead the school district. And he kept coming up with ways to show me what maybe was wrong with my logic. He said, why don't you go over and talk to the superintendent at Escondido? He's been a superintendent in several districts. Maybe he can give you some pointers on what it's like to be a superintendent. So I go over and make an appointment, and I'm sitting in the guy's office and looking up at his wall where there's a degree from Columbia University, and which didn't make me feel any better from my degree from Central Missouri State College. But we talked for a while, and then he said, Bill, and I'll quote, he said, just use your good Missouri common sense and you'll be fine. Well, that was the advice I got from him. So I come back and I talk to my wife, and she said, it's your decision. Whatever you choose, I'll support you. I said, I thought about it and I said, there's probably no other time that with my background that I'd have a chance to apply for a superintendent's job in the state of California. So I applied and I got the job, 5 of them. And I retired from that job almost 30 years later. Got the job in December of 1971 and I retired in June of 2001. So you have to, I know that I was in the right place at the right time. Don saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. And as I said, he was kind of my mentor in that whole time. He was willing to take a chance on an inexperienced 34-year-old vice principal, and he convinced the other 4 board members that I was up to the task. And he continued to offer his guidance and support until he left the board in 1979. So it's easy to see why I owe so much to Don Mitchell.